summer of 1944, northern France burns beneath a sky filled with the roar of engines and the smoke of dying machines. Above the fields near Caen, a German Messerschmitt Me-109 locks onto the silver outline of an American P-47 Thunderbolt. A short burst of fire. A flash of light, one target falls. For a second, the German pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Keller, feels invincible. He mutters a quick prayer to the fatherland as the enemy spirals downward, but fate changes faster than the wind. A moment later, his own plane shudders violently. A lucky .50 caliber round from the American gunner below pierces the fuel line. Flames swallow the cockpit. The world turns into a furnace of orange and black. The smell of burning oil fills his lungs as he grips the controls, shouting into the radio, "I'm hit, I'm falling." Static answers him back. Below, in a hedgerow not far from the wreck, a group of American infantrymen hear the scream through their field radio. It's broadcasting on their own frequency, the same channel used by Allied pilots. They freeze, listening to the desperate voice of the man who had just shot down one of their own. The scream cuts off with a thud that shakes the earth. Moments later, a column of fire climbs into the sky. The men run toward the crash. The wreckage lights up the forest, ammunition still cooking off in the heat. No one knows why they're running toward the danger, only that they are drawn by the sound of human suffering. In that instant, the war becomes smaller, reduced to a man trapped in metal and fire. The soldiers can almost hear him pounding against the glass. The same man who minutes earlier was an enemy, now screaming for breath in a burning cage. The air crackles with explosions. A single decision hangs in the balance: walk away or step into the inferno. The heat from the burning wreck was unbearable, even from 50 yards away. Ammunition inside the German plane cooked off in sharp, snapping bursts, tiny explosions that sounded like the war still raging around them. "Stay back!" shouted Sergeant William Harris, covering his face from the heat. "That thing's gonna blow." But one man didn't listen. Private First Class Robert Lang, a 22-year-old medic from Ohio, dropped his gear and ran forward. He wasn't thinking about uniforms or flags. He was thinking about lungs filling with smoke, about what it felt like to suffocate. The others shouted after him, but the roar of the fire drowned every word. Lang wrapped his field blanket around his arms and dove toward the cockpit. Inside, the pilot was still alive. Hans Keller's face was blackened, his hands trembling as he tried to release the belt buckle that had melted into place. He looked up through cracked glass and saw an American uniform framed against the firelight. For a brief, stunned moment, he believed he was hallucinating. The enemy was reaching in to save him. Lang smashed the canopy with a rifle butt, smoke clawing at his eyes. Flames licked across the wings, and the air was thick with fuel vapor. He grabbed Keller by the harness and dragged him out, rolling both of them into the dirt as a final explosion ripped through the fuselage. Shrapnel hissed past their heads like angry insects. Lang's hands were blistered, his sleeves burned through, but he kept patting Keller's chest, making sure he was breathing. When Keller coughed and gasped, Lang pressed his canteen to the pilot's lips and whispered, "You're done fighting now." The words came out rough, half a command, half a mercy. Keller blinked, unable to comprehend what was happening. He had been trained to believe Americans would shoot him on sight. Instead, one had risked his life to drag him from a fire, behind them. The other soldiers stood frozen. The wreck crackled behind the medic, lighting the trees with an eerie orange glow. Lang sat back on the ground, exhausted, sweat and soot dripping from his face. He looked down at the man he had just saved, a man who, only minutes before, had been trying to kill someone just like him. It wasn't pity that had driven him. It was something else, something older than nations and orders. Maybe instinct, maybe conscience, or maybe the kind of morality that doesn't vanish in war, no matter how many times you're told it should. The flames finally began to die, leaving only smoke and silence. Keller lay motionless, his chest rising slowly. The war had stopped for both of them, if only for a few minutes. The field hospital was a repurposed farmhouse near Bayeux, its windows covered with burlap, its corridors echoing with the smell of antiseptic and blood. The stretcher carrying Hans Keller arrived just before midnight. American medics moved with quiet precision, not a word wasted. The German pilot's burns were severe, his breathing shallow, but no one hesitated. Dr. Samuel Carter, a surgeon from Kansas City, examined the injuries under a single hanging lamp. The smell of scorched fabric and human skin filled the room. "Get me morphine," he said calmly, as though he were treating one of his own men. A young orderly stared, confused. "Sir, Carter didn't look up. "A pilot who went down," he said. "That's all I need to know." Hours later. When the operation was over and Keller was stabilized, a nurse named Evelyn Marsh sat outside writing in her diary. She could still hear the faint groans from the next room. "Tonight, I saw something that didn't fit in war," she wrote. An American medic pulled a German out of a burning plane, and the doctor worked on him as if the two wore the same uniform. The next morning, a sergeant stopped Carter by the coffee stove. "Doc, why'd you risk your neck for him?" the man asked. Carter sipped from his tin mug, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't save a German," he said quietly. "I saved a man who was dying. That's my job." The words spread through the barracks like a rumor. Soldiers repeated them over breakfast, testing their weight. It was a strange logic in a world where lines were supposed to be clear, friend and foe, victory and defeat, right and wrong. But somehow it made sense. In a war built on hatred, a single act of professionalism had become something radical. Later that afternoon, Keller woke. His eyes darted across the unfamiliar ceiling, the bandages covering his arms. He tried to speak, but the nurse hushed him, pressing a damp cloth to his lips. Through the haze of morphine, he thought of his own field hospital in France, where captured Americans were rarely treated with such care. The contradiction gnawed at him more than the pain itself. Outside, the sound of typewriters and jeeps replaced gunfire, for the first time since the invasion. The sky above was quiet. Keller listened to the distant hum of an Allied convoy and wondered what kind of enemy would pull him from a fire only to mend him afterward. The war had taught him many things, but this kind of mercy had not been among them, hours before the crash. The same German pilot had already performed an act that none of his rescuers could have imagined. The air battle that day had begun over the village of St. Lo. Clouds drifted low, visibility poor, and both sides were flying by instinct more than instruments. Keller had spotted a lone P-47 trailing smoke. Its pilot, Lieutenant Frank Doyle, was fighting to keep altitude, unaware that his right wing was leaking fuel. Keller lined up the shot, finger on the trigger. Then he hesitated. Through the canopy, he saw the other man struggling, his canopy half open, face streaked with oil, fighting the same wind and fear that Keller knew too well. For a brief second, their eyes met. Keller's gun jammed, or maybe his will did. He switched his transmitter. "Your wing is burning," he shouted in English, his accent heavy but clear. "Pull up, jump." It was madness, a Luftwaffe officer warning his enemy, but old instincts, buried deep beneath orders and slogans, had broken through. The human voice won out over the mechanical one of war. The American pilot never answered, but he heard it later. Frank Doyle would tell his squadron mates he had no idea why he pulled up when he did it, saved his life. His P-47 limped back to base, leaking fuel but intact. Doyle never knew that the warning came from the very man he'd later help rescue from the flames. When Keller's plane went down hours later, the radio still carried faint static from that transmission. The Americans who heard his cries for help assumed it was interference from their own pilots. No one realized they were hearing the same voice that had once shouted for one of theirs to survive. It would take months for the truth to surface. After Keller recovered in the camp hospital, an intelligence officer mentioned the strange coincidence, the voice on the Allied frequency, the accent, the timing. Frank Doyle was brought in to listen when Keller repeated the phrase in English. The young lieutenant froze. "That was you," he said, almost whispering. Keller nodded. The two men sat in silence. They had both fired at each other that morning. Both had missed death by minutes. That night, Doyle wrote home, "I met the German pilot I owe my life to. I don't know what to call him. Enemy seems wrong. Brother seems too much. Maybe just a man who remembered he was human. Two rescues, hours apart, bound by coincidence and conscience. Neither side had known they were saving the same man. in the chaos of war. Mercy had found a way to circle back. By the time the smoke cleared and the flames died, dusk had fallen over the French countryside. The wreck was nothing but a blackened skeleton, its metal still hissing in the cool air. The Americans began searching the debris for maps and papers, standard procedure for every crash. Private Lang, his arms wrapped in makeshift bandages, crouched beside the unconscious German pilot and checked his pockets for identification tags. From the inside pocket of Keller's flight jacket, Lang pulled out a small photograph, its edges curled and singed. It showed a man in uniform kneeling beside a little girl in a summer dress, her hair tied with ribbons. Keller's handwriting in blue ink read, "Für Anna, mein Licht, for Anna, my light." Lang stared at it for a long moment before folding it carefully and tucking it back where he found it. "Hey, what did you find?" a soldier asked. Lang just shook his head. Nothing important. But in truth, that photograph had hit him harder than the explosion. He reached into his own shirt pocket and pulled out a crumpled snapshot of his daughter back in Cleveland, 5 years old, missing 2 front teeth, grinning with the same innocence. He looked from one face to the other, realizing how absurd it all was. 2 fathers on opposite sides of a burning sky, both flying for flags that promised glory, both carrying the same small reminder of what they stood to lose. When Keller regained consciousness the next morning, Lang was still nearby, checking his pulse and changing his bandages. Keller's voice cracked as he whispered, "Did my photo survive?" Lang hesitated, then handed it to him. "She's still smiling," he said quietly. The German pilot clutched it to his chest as if it were oxygen. The ward fell silent. No speeches, no apologies. Just 2 men, one burned, one blistered, both thinking of daughters who might never understand why their fathers had nearly killed each other. Outside, rain began to fall, hissing softly on the ruins of the wrecked plane. It sounded almost like the sea. Lang turned toward the sound and said to no one in particular, "I wonder if she'll remember his face." That night, Keller's nurse, Evelyn Marsh, wrote in her diary again, "I saw the medic hand the enemy a photograph of his child. He smiled like any father would. War makes monsters of men, but sometimes it just strips them bare enough to look human again." The line between enemies blurred completely under that quiet rain. The sound of drops against tin roofs became a lullaby for both the wounded and the weary. Weeks later, when the German pilot had regained enough strength to sit upright, the formal interrogation began. It took place in a converted barn near the Normandy coast, now serving as the temporary Allied intelligence office. Maps covered the walls, typewriters clacked endlessly. The air smelled of damp paper, ink, and cigarette smoke. Captain John Mallory, an American officer fluent in German, conducted the questioning. He was patient, polite, the kind of man who believed truth came easier when treated with respect. Keller, dressed in a borrowed uniform shirt and trousers, sat across from him, pale but composed. Mallory began with simple questions. Name, unit, aircraft type. Keller answered mechanically. But when the officer leaned forward and asked, "Do you remember who saved you that night?" the rhythm faltered. Keller frowned. "You mean the one who pulled me out?" "Yes." Keller shook his head slowly. "That cannot be true. In Germany, we were told Americans would never help us. They would leave us to burn." Mallory smiled faintly. "You see, that's the difference," he said. "We teach our men to save, not to hate." The translator hesitated before repeating it in German. The words struck Keller like a slap, yet he couldn't find anger, only confusion. He looked down at his bandaged hands, at the tremor that hadn't left since the crash. He remembered the moment when the medic's face appeared through the flames. He had assumed it was a trick of dying senses, some ghostly apparition of mercy. Now he understood it was real. Outside, a storm gathered. Rain lashed against the roof as if echoing the tension in the room. Keller leaned forward. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would he risk his life for me?" Mallory exhaled. "Because if we stop saving, we stop being who we are." No more questions followed. The tape recorder clicked off. The sound of rain filled the silence like an answer no one wanted to disturb. That night, Keller couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, thinking of everything he had been taught: discipline, duty, victory, superiority, and how quickly those words had melted away under fire. What stayed instead were the eyes of the man who saved him, the voice of the doctor who said, "I saved the wounded, not the enemy." In the barracks nearby, A group of American soldiers played cards, laughter muffled through the thin walls. It sounded ordinary, human, almost peaceful. Keller listened for a long time before whispering to himself in German. Vielleicht haben Sie recht. Maybe they are right. He didn't know it then, but that small admission would follow him for decades. A decade passed before Hans Keller returned to France. The war was long over, but its shadows still clung to the countryside, the craters softened by grass, the ruins rebuilt but never forgotten. He was no longer the young pilot who had fallen through fire, nor the man consumed by propaganda. Time had stripped him bare, left him quiet, humble. He arrived at the same field near Bayeux on a gray afternoon in 1955. The land was calm now, dotted with poppies where the wreckage once burned. Keller carried a small wooden model airplane wrapped in cloth. Its wings were hand-carved, painted silver, the same color as the enemy's thunderbolt that had once shared his sky. He knelt by a lone tree and placed the model in the grass. The wind tugged gently at the propeller. Carved into one wing were 7 simple words: not enemies, just men who fell. The gesture wasn't for ceremony or forgiveness. It was for memory, for the medic whose name he had finally learned, Robert Lang, who died in Korea 5 years after saving him. Keller had written him letters that were never sent, words he could never quite say. He had learned that Lang left behind a daughter, the same age as Anna, his own. He whispered their names together, letting the sound fade into the wind. Then he wound the propeller and tossed the small plane into the air. For a moment, it caught a thermal, climbing higher than expected, gliding in slow circles over the field. Then it tilted, dipped its nose, and descended gracefully into the grass. Some French children nearby watched silently. One boy picked up the little model and turned it in his hands. "Monsieur, why did you let it fall?" he asked. Keller smiled faintly. "Because that's where it belongs," he said. It flew long enough. He turned toward the setting sun, the light catching on the healed burns of his hands. The sound of the tiny wooden propeller spinning in the wind was almost like the echo of an old engine, one that once roared in anger, now whispering in peace. As he walked away, the camera of memory would linger on that image, a toy plane resting on quiet grass, sunlight flickering across its wings. No smoke, no hatred, no noise, only silence, the kind earned, not given. And somewhere far away, across another sky, 2 daughters might have looked up at the same fading light, wondering what made men fight and what finally made them stop. History remembers wars through numbers, battles fought, planes destroyed, men lost, but what endures are moments like this, when compassion defied instruction. The story of Hans Keller and Robert Lang is not about victory or defeat. It is about recognition, one soul seeing another through the blur of smoke and orders. Mercy, in that instant, became more powerful than ideology. It crossed language, uniform, and cause. That burned field in France did not just swallow metal. It buried the illusion that enemies must always remain so. Keller's survival was not an act of chance. It was a fragment of the human spirit refusing to surrender. Decades later, historians found both men's diaries. In them were no heroic boasts, no tales of conquest, only quiet gratitude. Lang had written of the fire that burned without hatred. Keller had written of the man who saved me from becoming what the war wanted me to be. When veterans gathered years after, many could no longer remember where they fought, only who had pulled them from darkness. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of war, not the destruction it caused, but the humanity that somehow survived it. The field remains, silent and green. The wind still moves through the grass where fire once roared, and above it all, the sky, indifferent. Endless remembers 2 men who chose to save instead of kill.